What's up, everyone? I'm going to cut straight to the chase. It's Will, and today we're going to be talking about the art of learning. Now, this is a podcast audio experience show exclusive. I just want to tell you and remind you all that this is a specific episode that was recorded with podcast equipment specifically for podcasts. There's a lot of podcasters out there who aren't really podcasting. They're taking their YouTube video and stripping it down and converting it into a podcast. And you can kind of tell by the fact that their audio is grainy, that the whole episode is so short, and that it just cuts off abruptly, or the context of the conversation doesn't make sense because they keep referencing visuals. There's two big examples, Tai Lopez and Gary Vaynerchuk. And even these people are starting to realize that this isn't the best approach, but just want to remind you that from the start, these podcast episodes have been strictly for the podcast. So hope you enjoy that. And today's episode is actually incredibly special because we're going to be talking about the art of learning. And if you're not familiar, the art of learning is something that it's not just some wishy-washy art thing. This is something that I studied from people who are incredibly successful at learning. And to really explain this and how this can really benefit your life, my promise to you is that with these tactics, you can potentially speed up how long it takes you to get to whatever your end goal is, whether it's a mastery of a craft or it's something where you want to become rich or happy or fulfilled, or you want to have better relationships or improve your communication skills or anything else. Because ultimately, most of the stuff we're doing is to become a master of some type of craft. And to do that, of course, you need to learn how to get better at that skill. And of course, to learn how to get better, you need to learn. And learning is actually a skill. So here's a quick story to kind of illustrate to you why learning is so important, because I didn't really understand how important it was until a few things happened. The first story goes to a man that you've probably never heard of. Or maybe you have. He's actually fairly famous, but not to the mainstream public. He's famous amongst the self-help industry, I guess you can call it, the entrepreneurship industry too. His name's Josh Waitzkin, and Tim Ferriss has done many podcast episodes explaining his story and his life and his tips. But if you're not familiar, Josh Waitzkin, he was a child champion at chess, and he won the national championship title numerous times consecutively when he was still very young. And then he went on to then compete internationally. And this was all at a very young age. He was probably still a teenager at that point. And it gets even crazier. So that's not even the crazy part. So he's this world-class champion of chess, one of the toughest, intricate games of knowledge out there. But it doesn't end there. From there, and this is all before the age of 30, he did this by his early 30s. He then went on to become the world champion at a martial art called Tai Chi Chuan. The full name is Tai Chi Chuan Push Hands. It's a very specific type of martial arts. But he's ended up becoming the champion of that too. So and here's the big question, how did he become a master of two very different skill sets in such a short time when most people can't become the master of one skill set in their whole lifetime of practice? And of course, with mastery comes a lot of things: respect, admiration, fame, fortune, and all those things. So just to remind you again why it's important. But that at least is the question in theory, and that's the question that Tim Ferriss constantly pushes and many other people kind of push. And it's the real reason that sparks interest around Josh Waitzkin. So he actually wrote a whole book called The Art of Learning that explains why and how he was able to do something like this. And he claims that it all comes down to the fact that he was a better learner than everyone else. Isn't that interesting? He didn't say, oh, it's because I'm gifted at this or that or whatever. He said that the reason he was so successful so quickly was simply because he was better at learning than other people, and that learning is a specific art and craft that most people don't understand and don't know how to improve upon, and so they learn slower and improve slower. And I found that very fascinating. I never thought of learning like that, and from there I was hooked. I was like, man, I gotta get better at learning. So I read his book, The Art of Learning. Now, there's more to my story of being convinced that learning is important than that. As you may or may not already know, I spend a lot of time studying billionaires for fun in my free time. So I've gone through all sorts of books and interviews. I've listened to every possible interview and video clip I could find on the entire internet of Warren Buffett. It sounds like a lot, and it kind of is, but when you break it into like over the course of 3 or 4 years, it's much more digestible. But anyhow, Warren Buffett, one of his big sayings, being one of the richest people in the world consistently for decades, his saying is, learners are earners. And the more you learn, the more you earn. And he constantly addresses the importance of learning. And his business partner, who's also a billionaire, Charlie Munger, he often has many quotes about learning too. He says almost every shareholder meeting they have with the shareholders of their company, they mention something about the importance of learning. The latest shareholder meeting that I watched, Charlie Munger was emphasizing how Warren Buffett was still learning at the age of like his late 80s. And the fact that he bought shares in the company Apple, it was a great example that he was learning and doing something that he would never done before. And he goes on and on about how important lifelong learning is and how most people stop learning as soon as they graduate college because they think they don't have to anymore and they don't see any value in it. And the real successful people keep learning until they die. So you can kind of start seeing the importance and this new opportunity of learning that most people aren't even aware of, and how we can just capitalize on this because most people don't do this. Now, with learning though, it's incredibly interesting because I would have never thought of some of the things that Josh Waitzkin has on how to learn better. And just as a quick disclaimer, I am already a really, really good learner. So to say that is a huge compliment to Josh Waitzkin. And the reason why I say I'm a good learner already is because I've been complimented on my learning by a couple people recently. And on top of that, and this is really the big reason, I've taken strengths tests and personality tests, and learning often comes up as my number 1 or number 2 trait consistently. And I know I'm a above average learner because I am constantly consuming knowledge, listening to audiobooks, podcasts, interviews, reading articles, probably 2 to 5 times more than the average person. I mean, I go through a lot of stuff on a daily basis. Not as much as Warren Buffett. He claims he reads from 6 to 8 hours a day. I'm not at that level. And reading isn't my medium of choice. Shocker, I know. But for me, it's actually listening. After a lot of experimentation, for me, it is listening, believe it or not. Podcasts and audiobooks are the fastest and most efficient way that I digest a lot of information. And so I'm already above average in learning, and I've still learned quite a lot about how I can learn better. Kind of a paradox. But I really want to give you some of the best points to what I learned from this book, The Art of Learning. And if you want even more detail, I wrote out a very extensive article on my blog, willyoulaugh.com, that you can search up. And from that article, it's pretty much a book summary of all the points in detail. But I just want to highlight some of the big ones in this podcast. So let's just get started. Some of this is incredible. Number one, here's one of the biggest things. This was fascinating. So make sure you capitalize and emphasize learning the fundamental skills that make up 80% of your results. Now, maybe that's a little obvious, but it's not when I explain it. So in almost any skill, whether it's cooking or playing the piano, there's a bunch of different tactics or techniques in them. Whether it's to do something faster or quicker, or to play the keys better if I were to use piano analogies, or to develop skills at a specifically hard passage in the music. There's all these different tactics and techniques, maybe even hundreds. However, there are a few fundamental techniques in almost any skill set, at least that's what Josh claims, that you can leverage. And if you spend more time focusing on understanding these, you will progress beyond the rest of your classmates, because you're leveraging what matters more and will impact more of your craft. So I'll give you a great example. I recently bought a Groupon to a month's worth of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu martial arts classes. I chose BJJ, that's what they call it, because it's something that is the most practical. It's one of the best practical martial arts if you want to defend yourself. And I took the class, and I was in there, and throughout that month, I observed everyone else and how the class was structured and flowed and how things were taught. And what I noticed is that, man, this works perfectly for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because usually the classes would go something like they would teach one or two techniques at the beginning of the class. And then if they have time, they would teach a more advanced technique. Maybe it's a special chokehold, a more advanced escape routine if you get caught in a specific position while you're on the ground wrestling someone else. And there's almost like endless combinations of situations you can be in when you're wrestling someone else and you're caught in a chokehold or in a position. And therefore, almost an endless amount of different techniques and strategies to get out of them. And of course, it would take you forever to remember all of these. But they would teach a new one every class. And I noticed that most of the students would pay equal attention to each of these. And the amount of attention and focus they would pay would be average by definition. So they would focus for maybe 60 to 80%. And then you could tell that their mind started drifting because the teacher was droning on. And then they would kind of daydream or whatever. That tends to happen. Anyhow, I noticed that I applied this technique to the class, and I realized, you know what? There's only a few fundamental techniques in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Everything else revolves around these techniques. What is that? First is the arm bar. Most things revolve around getting someone into an arm bar or preventing someone from getting you into an arm bar. Another would be side control, and then there's blah, blah, blah. But the point is, I focused an extra amount of attention on these, and by doing so, I got a disproportionate amount of results. Ramit Sethi, who is a famous online entrepreneur, he uses the same concept for productivity, and online marketing and business success online. He talks a lot about disproportionate rewards. It's almost eerily the same concept. But I applied it to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, very similar to how Josh Waitzkin applied it to martial arts. And I spent a lot of time, more than the average classmate, focusing on my form and actually getting a good armbar. The rest of my classmates, at least the beginners that were my level, they had horrible armbars and they didn't spend enough time focusing on it, even though the armbar made up a good portion of whether or not you actually ended up getting someone to tap and ending the wrestling bout. And of course, I also focused on just a couple other main things, such as escaping an armbar, getting into side control, escaping side control, and getting into full guard or full control. You get the point. There's only a few fundamental things that were most important. See, simplicity and minimizing the options can actually be critical to your success. And of course, there's plenty of other examples. Tim Ferriss, he actually wrote a book on the art of learning himself, using his own tactics and techniques. I think in terms of learners out there, Tim Ferriss is also up there in terms of rapid learning or accelerated learning, whatever you want to call it. And I read his book too, The 4-Hour Chef, and that's a story for another time. But he also does this as well. That's how he was able to learn Japanese and score higher than his Japanese native friend on a Japanese language test. And he was able to learn Japanese by simply focusing on memorizing and understanding to a very high level the 5% of words that made up 80% of the language, rather than what everyone else did, which was his classmates spent an equal amount of time learning a lot more words. So he focused on the most frequent words, while everyone else focused on developing this massive vocabulary of words that they would rarely ever use. So, interesting things. I really think they should apply this to teaching as well, so people can teach better, and therefore we can learn better. So, here's one that's a little less common. I'm skipping over one I just saw, which I wrote down, which is to invest in loss. It's basically to embrace your mistakes, and I think plenty of entrepreneurs and their podcasts have pounded that point to death already. So I'll skip that one. Let's move on to put aside your ego so that you can learn and win. Now, this touches on investment in loss, but essentially what is going on here is Josh realized that a lot of his classmates got to a moderately high level in chess and in push hands, but they plateaued because they couldn't put aside their ego. They couldn't be humiliated or embarrassed or shown that they weren't that great or weak. And because they weren't willing to do that, they weren't willing to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and progress. And because they had this ego where they had to be the best, or they had everyone else they had to make everyone else believe that they were the best, or whatever else, they were unwilling to let someone else or acknowledge that someone else was better. And of course, they weren't able to learn. So a very simple concept, but think about it. How does this relate to what you're doing? Maybe you're playing piano, or you want to be a better table tennis person, but when someone comes in and they try and help you or give you guidance, you push them away because you say, hey, I'm better than you, even though that's not true, because you don't want to be embarrassed, or you want to fit in. So that's really important. Acknowledge it, and then really figure out how you can solve this. Maybe it's really weighing what you want more. Do you want to get better, or do you just want to be the top of your small mountain? Josh Waitzkin actually, he had a lot of huge stories to illustrate this. One was this really buff, kind of mean guy who he trained with, and he almost pushed him around a bit. And this was when he was doing Tai Chi push hands, and he was always better than him, but then Josh eventually caught up, and the guy would never really push himself if it meant exposing any weakness or losing a battle. So he would always seek opponents to practice with that were weaker than him. And it was more so about, hey, I beat you, and almost the thrill or enjoyment of winning, and the fear and insecurity and embarrassment and avoidance of that embarrassment that prevented him from seeking stronger opponents. And he, of course, never got better because of that. There's another example in his book where when he was a chess kid, a chess prodigy kid, he encountered this one boy who wasn't that great a chess player, but in his local tiny town, everyone worshipped the kid because he had never lost a game. And Josh predicted that this kid would refuse to play a single game when they met. And of course, he was right. They met at this moderate level tournament, and the kid refused to play a game because he had been enamored with this whole picture of himself as the best chess player of all time, and he didn't want to shatter that image. And he knew deep down that it wasn't true, or maybe he didn't, but the point was he didn't want to risk losing because then he wouldn't be undefeated. And I believe that deep down on some level, he knew that he wasn't all that great, and there's a good chance that if he played someone, he would have lost. And therefore, this kid never got better than his local standing because he let ego get in his way. So I've beaten that point to death. Let's move on to another point. Try to stop repeating mistakes as soon as possible. So this is something that is maybe obvious. When I first read it, I was like, this is a bit obvious, but let's hear me out here. What he really means is that, most of us think we learn from mistakes. And of course, we can't always, as soon as we learn from mistakes, never repeat it again, because sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes it requires muscle memory or motor memory, or especially any type of physical skill. It requires practice to start moving away from that mistake, especially if it's an intricate piano trill. I used to play piano competitively, and there were some tough piano trills and passages where you had to play really fast and play a lot of notes. And even if you knew and you learned from your mistakes on what to do and what not to do, you still make the same mistake because your muscles and your muscle memory hasn't caught up yet. But what he means is you really want to start moving towards not making that mistake as efficiently and quickly as possible. And the average human tends to drag it out because they're not really consciously aware enough of this. And they spend maybe sometimes up to 10 times or 100 times longer to fix the mistake than necessary because they just get stuck in that. Or they just don't keep notes and they repeat the mistake because life gets in the way and they forget about it. And then they come back 2 months later to practice on the same skill set and they repeat the same mistake. Okay, next point. Improvement is a balance of pushing your comfort zone, but not so much that you break. So he recommends that you want to push your comfort zone, but there's a healthy medium in between where it's not so much pushing your comfort zone that you burn out and you break down, but not so little that you're too comfortable. For example, if you were to challenge the toughest guy at your gym constantly to martial arts, you might just get exhausted and you might not learn anything because they're doing stuff way out of your league of understanding because you're just a beginner. Assuming, again, you're a beginner martial artist. Let's just stick with this analogy here so that you understand what I'm saying. The other thing is if you just keep practicing only with this friend of yours who's worse than you, and in your comfort zone, you're not going to get better because you know all of his tricks. How are you going to get better? There's nothing that he will do to outsmart you 99 times out of 100, and you're not learning anything or improving. It's just the same old mediocre thing. So there's an area in between where you want to kind of just focus on and really get right. So Josh, he actually won the elementary school national championship for chess when he was a kid for the United States of America. He beat out 1,500 competitors. And after the whole event, like, you would assume him to be like so excited and extravagant, and as if he, as if you were the happiest person on earth because you had won such a huge title. But the heavens didn't open. After a couple days, he went right back down to his normal levels of happiness before he ever won the championship. And he was just a regular boy again who went to school and, played with his friends. And he realized, and of course there's a lot of other stories that people tell that almost have the same exact story arc to them, because it's a very common thing. People think that money and fame and all this other stuff will bring you happiness, but the hedonic adaptation effect is at play. Hedonic treadmill will ratchet you back down to your normal levels of happiness. So the point of that is to just remember to keep in mind the journey more than the destination. Enjoy the process, because if you're too cutthroat and serious on yourself about winning, you might not get there. Here's another interesting, maybe even counterintuitive piece of advice from Josh. He said, make sure you recharge and take a break, even if your competitors aren't. When Josh was competing, he had a lot of classmates who were just exhaustive, disgustingly hard workers. From January to December, every single day of the year, they would train for like 12 to 18 hours a day. There was no stop to the chess training. And even during the competition, during the chess games, these people would still be training and practicing during their breaks. And Josh and his father never did that. In fact, after they won a major tournament, his father had him take like 2 to 4 week vacation in the middle of nowhere in like a lake retreat. And he wasn't allowed to even play chess. He just had to fish and stuff to allow him to recharge. And he really emphasizes the importance of that. He even kind of, during a chess game, he will even walk out of the room and go for a jog just to kind of decompress and recharge his mind, which was it's not as unusual as you think, because at that level, a game will last for 5 to 6 hours. And it really gets his creative juices flowing. So rather than think of it as unproductive, think of it as a opportunity to unleash your creative mind. Usually your creative mind gets unleashed when it's relaxed and it's not in a state of stress or focus on your craft, when it's doing something else. So keep that in mind, try it out. Okay, the next tip I want to give you from reading The Art of Learning is to embrace cheating. This one really struck me hard. And I'm going to string this on with another tip that's very related. He also says, not only embrace cheating, but embrace distractions. These are two things that I really had a hard time throughout my whole life struggling with. And for him to explain how he dealt with them, I just applauded him, because this man really thought on a more scientific, evolved, higher level than I did. And it's just so amazing. And I'm so blessed to be able to learn from him. Let me explain. So when I was a kid, all the way until the age I am now, I had a huge time with any type of distractions. They would annoy me. They would piss me off. And I would get really angry. And I would get even angrier if I was doing something productive, because I was doing good, and yet I wasn't rewarded for it. For example, my family made a lot of noise, and they would scream and shout, especially my siblings who were kids at the time. They would scream and shout, and no matter how angry I got or how much I yelled at them, they couldn't help it because they were kids. And I would yell at my parents, and I would say, "Don't you want me to succeed and do better at school? I'm trying to study here." And quite honestly, like it made me even more mad because they really wanted me to do well in school, and yet they were sabotaging me by, distracting me with all these noises. Anything outside of peace and quiet pissed me off when I was studying, and I had to study for long hours every weekday night. So, long story short, I never really figured that out. Ultimately, I would just try and tune it out. Maybe I'd blare music. Sometimes I didn't have access to music to blare, and it just kind of pissed me off more. Again, this was at a time when the iPod was rather new, and I couldn't afford it. My family couldn't afford it yet. So you kind of get a sense for how this is. But the point was, these things happen, and they will happen no matter what you do. And for Josh, he had it up the nose. People were screaming, taking pictures of him, and he was a celebrity, and it distracted him like heck. Josh was the basis for a really famous chess movie, Searching for Bobby Fischer, and he became a celebrity. And of course, it really pissed him off rather than, what most people would do, which would be they would love the fame. But it really annoyed him because it made any type of chess match he played very, very difficult because he was so annoyed. He couldn't get any peace or quiet to think. And then when he played Tai Chi Chuan push hands, he had all sorts of cheating that he had to deal with. So there were people who would eye gouge and hide it from the refs so that you couldn't see and there's nothing you could do. There's people who would do all sorts of illegal stuff. And then during the whole national championship finals, he had to deal with all sorts of cheating because, again, it wasn't as regulated as an international Olympics competition. And the country that hosted it wanted their own team to win. So they did all sorts of crap to screw with this guy. They changed the whole rules of how big the wrestling arena was to a fraction of the size that he had trained years against. And then the stadium, there's a platform, like a stone platform that they have to stand on for the standing portion of Tai Chi Chuan push hands competition. And on the day of the finals competition, they eliminated the stone thing, even though he had been training on it for months. And on and on and on. They did all sorts of these tricky tactics, and he experienced the same thing during chess. When he would play against these people in chess, his blood would boil because they would cheat and get away with it. And he thought it was so unethical because he never cheated, but strictly because he got angry, he let those people get to him, and that's all they wanted. And of course, he lost because of that. So they would kick him under the table really, really hard consistently. And then he would catch a Russian competitor talking with his teacher in Russian and exchanging trade secrets and knowledge that they shouldn't be able to share. And all these things took place because, again, it wasn't as regulated as it could be. And, no matter how regulated it gets, there's always going to be some stuff that leaks out. And on top of that, it was just very hard for a ref to prove that this was happening. And it was very hard for him to prove to a ref. So at first he was pissed off like me, but he did something I never did. And this is something I learned from him. Embrace it. So he embraced the noise. He started playing the most annoying music and sounds he could find on his earphones or in his room while he practiced chess on purpose every single day to get used to distractions. So rather than trying to hide away from the noise or wish for the perfect scenario, he adopted the noise. He embraced the noise and made it part of his standard routine, which is ingenious because heck, you know, there are no real rules in the real world. There are man-made rules, but if something falls through the cracks of those man-made rules and you have trouble dealing with it, even if it is cheating, if it's part of the game, you have to play with the game and find some way of dealing with that. And what I did was I just got mad and pissed off and said, this isn't fair. But he did something much smarter, which was embrace it. He embraced the cheating and he essentially said, I'm going to win despite of the cheating. So when he could, he would practice and account for the cheating. So when he knew that eye gouging and that sort of stuff would always be a component of competition, even though it was illegal, he started practicing with these cheaters. They were unethical people, but he practiced in his free time with Tai Chi Chuan push hands, and he would practice with these people who would eye gouge and do illegal tactics. Eye gouging, if you guys don't know, is poking someone in the eye. And so, long story short, that's what he did, and it paid off. It really did. He prepared for these tactics, and during competition, he knew what to do and how to deflect an eye gouge. So, of course, check out my blog, willyoulaugh.com, if you want more insights. I have a whole article that I'll be releasing on the Art of Learning book. And if you do nothing else, please join my email newsletter for the best secrets of peak performance, billionaires, and high achievers. If you want to join, all you got to do is go to my blog, willyoulaugh.com, and there will be plenty of opportunities that you'll see on the site to enter your email address and join my newsletter where I release my top secrets and golden nuggets that I've learned from my studies. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.